Hot.
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Monday morning to you. We're going to flip the calendar back, or the days back a couple of days to last week, Thursday, when freshman Congressman Mark Harris, who serves the 8th Congressional District here across the state of North Carolina, led the North Carolina Republican delegation in sending a letter to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security demanding a complete and total overhaul of FEMA. This is following reports that FEMA allegedly sent millions to house illegal immigrants in high-end hotels in New York City. The letter, Harris told Carolina Journal in an exclusive interview, quote, "Rogue FEMA operators sent $59 million to house illegal aliens in luxury hotels while many North Carolinians are still homeless from the devastation of Hurricane Helene. Totally disgraceful. This latest scandal just reaffirms that we need a complete and total overhaul of FEMA. President Trump was right to call the agency a failure. Congress must conduct oversight and ensure this kind of corruption never happens again." FEMA, in collaboration with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, manages the funds in questions, according to the website. For fiscal year 2024, Congress allocated $650 million to the Shelter and Service Program, known as SSP. This program provides financial assistance to non-federal entities to support housing and shelter-related services for non-citizen migrants after their release from the Department of Homeland Security. It also followed a January report that Helene victims were kicked out of hotels despite extended deadlines. The letter reads in part, quote, In the wake of Hurricane Helene, North Carolina has witnessed firsthand the need for serious FEMA reforms to better address the federal response to future natural disasters. There is no doubt that a complete and total overhaul of FEMA is necessary. Therefore, we applaud the president for the much-needed call to re-examine FEMA. We hope to gain greater insight into FEMA's activity during the Biden administration that paved the way for this scandalous distribution of funds that prioritized illegal aliens over the American people. The letter was also signed by Representative Virginia Foxx, Representative Addison McDowell, Representative Pat Harrigan, Representative Chuck Edwards, and Representative Tim Moore. Foxx and Edwards are the only signers not in their freshman term. McDowell flipped the district when elected to Democrat Kathy Manning's seat. Harrigan was elected to Republican Patrick McHenry's seat, while Harris flipped Republican Dan Bishop's seat, who stepped down to run for Attorney General. Harrigan told Carolina Journal, quote, "FEMA's job is to help Americans rebuild after disasters, not funnel millions to luxury hotels for illegal immigrants. The fact that unelected bureaucrats diverted $60 million in taxpayer funds for this purpose is a slap in the face to North Carolinians still recovering from Hurricane Helene. North Carolina Republicans are demanding full accountability, and we won't stop until FEMA is reformed to put the American citizen first." Former House Speaker and now Congressman Tim Moore also said in the letter, quote, "When Hurricane Helene tore through western North Carolina, many constituents needed immediate action, but instead they were met with bureaucratic delays and excuses. Under the previous administration, FEMA has been bogged down by mismanagement and political agendas. I am proud to work with President Trump and my colleagues in North Carolina to completely reform FEMA from the ground up and put the American people first." A lot of discussion about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, over the last couple of weeks. We are expecting additional details as the Trump administration has put together a team to do a deep dive into FEMA and provide him with a recommendation on what to do with that agency going forward. We will, of course, continue to track that. Any details coming out of the administration or members of Congress, will pass it along to you, not only over at CarolinaJournal.com, but right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:09, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. There continues to be a lot of attention on the state of North Carolina on the national political stage due to the fact that our largest voting bloc is unaffiliated voters, and we are very much a swing state. To get some additional details this morning on a Democrat committee that is targeting North Carolina in upcoming elections, Brianna Kraemer, CarolinaJournal.com, joins us this morning on the News Hour. Brianna, what is the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee?
Yeah, the DLCC, Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, is a Democratic Party's arm that works to elect Democrats into the state legislatures across the country. So they're pushing for Democrat candidates, and they're pushing all across the country in all 50 states to make up the state legislatures. And so this week, the group unveiled its target map for the 2025-2026 election cycle, and they listed 11 different target states. And among these states is North Carolina. North Carolina's House and Senate are both listed as one of their target states because of their razor-thin supermajority margin. So it's something that the Democrat Party on the national level is watching closely, is the North Carolina General Assembly going into the next 2 years.
I see they've got a couple of different listings on their map: watch list, power building, and battleground states. North Carolina's in that middle category of power building. What was the rationale behind that?
Yeah, so North Carolina is that second tier power building state for them. That's their focus area, is power building in both the House and the Senate. The North Carolina House and Senate offered Democrats the best opportunities to gain seats in tough chambers and check MAGA extremism. This is what the DLCC says, including by defending the veto power of Democratic governors. So basically, of course, we have our Republican supermajority in the Senate, and we actually lost that supermajority by 1 seat in the House. But the Democrat governor is where this target comes in, because they want to make sure that Republicans don't maintain a supermajority that's able to override the governor's vetoes right now.
Now, if we zoom out a little bit, Brianna, it's been a rough couple of years for Democrats in North Carolina. In the final few years of Roy Cooper's term, anything that he disagreed with, the General Assembly was able to ram through with that veto-proof majority that you're talking about. It's been very hard for Democrats to get wins in this state. It's got to be very frustrating for them, and I'm sure for some of these national groups as well.
That's right. Yeah, definitely. Over the last decade or so, Republicans have held on tight in the North Carolina General Assembly, not so much in the executive branch, but when it comes to voting in the presidential elections and the General Assembly for the state legislature, it's gone very red in North Carolina. But then you look at the governor's seat, and that's trended Democrat, with Governor Josh Stein now taking that seat. And so they want to be able to protect his veto pen. And that's what the political director of DLCC said in a press conference on Friday, is that North Carolina fits here because we must protect Governor Josh Stein's veto pen. His veto power rests on a single seat in the House right now, and we must defend that progress that we made from last cycle. So they're claiming credit for last year, taking away 1 seat in the House that cost the Republicans that supermajority margin.
Now, it's important, I guess, as we talk about this, we're talking about strict party affiliation here. We're not necessarily talking about votes. And we've seen in the past how Republicans have been able to convince just a couple of Democrats to work across the aisle with them to get things done. I imagine that probably plays into some of this as well.
Yeah, and that's certainly the case here. We know that there's Democrats in the General Assembly that are working or that are willing to work across the aisle. And so it's not just about partisan politics and sticking to your side, because we know that if they have negotiations that go on, they could potentially get Democrats to also flip to their side in this session when it comes to, just bills getting passed in general, and even possibly overriding any vetoes from the governor.
We'll continue the conversation with Brianna Kraemer coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We'll get a look at traffic on your President's Day Monday morning. An update with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. your emergency situation station.
Hot. It's 5:20. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Good Monday morning to you. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Keeping our attention in Washington, D.C. this morning, another piece of legislation introduced by freshman Congressman Mark Harris led his group of Republican colleagues in introducing the No Asylum for Criminals Act. If this legislation is to become law, individuals convicted of a crime in a foreign country would be barred from seeking asylum in the United States. Harris said, quote, "Asylum should be reserved for individuals who need it because of persecution, not granted to violent criminals." After the Biden administration abused the law to intentionally let illegal aliens into our country, it's clear we need to strengthen our asylum laws. Allowing convicted felons to enter the United States not only risks the safety of American citizens, but it also risks the safety of other asylum seekers and adds to the backlog of claims. That's why I introduced the No Asylum for Criminals Act to end the abuse of our asylum laws and restore the integrity of our immigration system. We must send a clear message. America is not a refuge for the world's violent criminals. This legislation would amend the Immigration and Nationality Act to provide that an alien who has been convicted of a crime is ineligible for asylum and for other purposes. The bill, if passed, again, would amend that. According to the current version of the act, an individual is ineligible for asylum if they meet any of the following exceptions. Quote, have been convicted by a final judgment of a particularly serious crime and are considered a danger to a U.S. community. They committed a serious non-political crime outside of the United States before arriving. There are reasonable grounds to believe they pose a threat to U.S. security and that they firmly resettled in another country before reaching the United States. That legislation is also co-sponsored by Republican Chuck Edwards out of the 11th Congressional District in North Carolina. Edwards told the Carolina Journal, quote, "It's time we stop importing criminals from across the world into America. The No Asylum for Criminals Act will help address one of the gaps in our broken immigration system by making sure that no one with a felony or misdemeanor is granted asylum into our country. America is a refugee for those genuinely fleeing prosecution, but known criminals should not be allowed to flee one country to cause violence in another." We will be continuing to track this legislation over at carolinajournal.com and here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's 5:23, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Continuing our conversation this morning with the Democratic Leadership Campaign Committee with Brianna Kraemer from carolinajournal.com. Now, North Carolina elects our General Assembly every 2 years, so that'll, of course, be coming up in 2026, which will be a midterm year. Brianna, history tells us that midterm years are typically not as great for the party in charge. That would be the GOP up at the national level. So the possibility for some Democrats to score major political points here in North Carolina.
Yeah, that could be the case in the years to come now that in Washington, D.C., we see that it's a full-on GOP Republican control of the executive branch and then also Congress right now. So that could be the case. It's interesting, the DLCC also has a list of battleground states. These are like their primary targets in the state legislatures. And some of those are swing states that we were watching in this past election: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Alaska. So they have some state legislatures also in similar standings that the Democrat Party is already working to target, which brings me to the point of not just midterms like you mentioned, but also 2030 is a very interesting year that lies ahead for us because of redistricting. And that's what some of the leaders of DLCC were saying on Friday, is that they're getting ready for 2030 and the redistricting, that happens across the country for the congressional maps. And so that's something that's pretty far out still that they are keeping an eye out on, which plays into their focus on state legislatures now for the years ahead.
North Carolina, of course, has a very checkered past when it comes to redistricting, constant lawsuits. It's been a very interesting couple of years in regards to that. Now, Brianna, I understand this group is focusing more on the legislature, but we've talked in the past about the Senate race that's going to be taking place in North Carolina in 2026. Tom Tillis likely to be the Republican candidate, and potentially somebody like former Governor Roy Cooper stepping up to bat for the Democrats. You can only imagine the national attention this state's going to get in about 18 months or so.
Absolutely. The money we know will flood in for a big Senate race like this. And Republicans now have control of Senate up on Capitol Hill in D.C. But, that can obviously change every few years when a new election comes. And so it's definitely going to be a big race here, and it will determine, what happens in Congress for the second half of the Trump administration.
The president of the DLCC made some comments as well during the event on Friday. What did he have to say?
Yeah, so there was a couple of different leaders that were just kind of explaining the map. If you go to carolinajournal.com, you can see the map that the DLCC has created for their target states and the states that are on the watch list and the other states on the power building of the map. But really, they're focusing, as I just mentioned, on building up state power into 2030. And they were actually kind of maybe ironically talking about state power and how, because Washington, D.C. is now very Republican controlled for the next 2 years, it's important to take a focus on the state legislatures and the state power, which might be a little ironic because they were, we know Democrats criticize defunding or getting rid of some federal agencies, like the Department of Education was one thing that was mentioned, getting rid of that. And so that's going to put a big emphasis on states, right? Because it would go back to the states to focus on education themselves. And so that's an area that the Democrats were talking about where they can focus their efforts. But ultimately, that is the point that Republicans in D.C. are trying to make, is that we want this to go back to the states because the states are closer to the people. And that's where some policy items like education, or even maybe like FEMA, that's a different possibility Trump has mentioned, maybe that stuff belongs closer to the people at the state level. So it's interesting hearing Democrats talk about that, because that's now their focus area for the next couple of years in terms of party power.
Well, and it's important to note that everything going on in Washington, D.C. with Trump, with Elon Musk, with his various cabinet picks, whether it's Tulsi Gabbard or RFK that are now confirmed in those positions, Brianna, that kind of sucks a lot of the air out of the room, and there's not as much focus, there's not as much attention, at least for broad swaths of the North Carolina public, on what's actually going on in our state. And we know in these midterm elections, when the General Assembly is up every 2 years, the voter turnout isn't super high.
Yeah, that's right. Voter turnout, comes and goes, especially with presidential elections. That's really key to getting people to turn out in these high profile races. So the Senate race in 2 years might draw more people out. But yeah, depending on voter engagement and how big the parties can kind of pull people in and how big of a deal they can actually make, the election will definitely have a big impact on North Carolina, the General Assembly's next session, because right now we're focused on the legislative session beginning now. But, there's people, especially in the political world, that are looking further ahead than just now and just this year. People looking ahead to what's going to happen at all levels of government after 2026 and up to 2030 and beyond.
You mentioned the map, and there's some other quotes in your story. Where can folks go and read that this morning?
Yeah, just go to carolinajournal.com and you can read the full story and see the map there.
Brianna Kraemer joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at traffic on your Monday morning. We'll get an update with Boomer Von Cannon.
Thank you, Nick.
Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Don't forget that you can watch the show live each and every weekday morning over on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. You can also take the show with you on demand on your own time by checking out the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast in your favorite podcast app. Just search for the show, subscribe or follow, and you'll get a new program delivered each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Well, we've had a big focus this morning on Washington, D.C. and some legislation and things going on there. However, what we've got this morning, additionally to that, is a coalition of organizations urging Congress to terminate the subsidies associated with the aptly named Inflation Reduction Act and elements of the Green New Deal it codified in policy. The coalition, which does include the John Locke Foundation Center for Food, Power, and Life, argues that these subsidies are counterproductive and impose undue financial burden on the taxpayer. If you'll remember back, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed by Congress in August of 2022 when inflation was running at some 9% over the summer months there and was signed by President Joe Biden. It passed the United States Senate in August by a vote of 51-50, with all Republicans opposing it. Vice President Kamala Harris casting the tie-breaking vote at the time. It passed the United States House of Representatives by a vote of 220-207, with all Democrats voting in favor and all Republicans opposing it. The Inflation Reduction Act was a major spending and tax law bill that was billed as an effort to reduce inflation, lowering prescription drug costs, and promoting clean energy investments. Though critics argue it was more of a climate and tax law bill than an inflation-fighting measure at all. Spending a whopping $369 billion on climate policy, it created tax credits and subsidies for solar, wind, and electric vehicles alongside other renewable energy sources. And it also raised corporate taxes and set aside $80 billion for the Internal Revenue Service to hire more agents. The coalition, which, as I noted, does include the John Locke Foundation, says, quote, "The Inflation Reduction Act is filled with numerous subsidies that were designated to shift our country away from reliable electrical generation, coal and natural gas, to unreliable electrical sources, for example, wind and solar. This comes at a time of concern about the reliability of the nation's electrical grid, in larger part because of misguided corporate welfare policies that undermine reliable baseload generation. There are also Inflation Reduction Act subsidies that work in conjunction with other policies, such as the Environmental Protection Agency's de facto electric vehicle mandate, an attempt to kill off gas vehicles, undermining the freedom of Americans to choose their cars. The coalition's statement emphasizes that the subsidies have led to increased government spending without delivering the promise of environmental benefits. They contend that the financial incentives have distorted energy markets, leading to inefficient and higher costs for consumers. The coalitions also raised concerns about long-term economic impacts, suggesting that the subsidies could hinder innovation by promoting reliance on government support rather than market-driven solutions. In a recent analysis, the John Locke Foundation highlighted several ways in which the Inflation Reduction Act may adversely affect Americans. The foundation points out that by raising taxes on corporations and reducing the productivity of capital, the Inflation Reduction Act could potentially shrink the economy and contribute to inflation, which of course would be completely counter to its name. They note that the poorest households are disproportionately harmed by inflation and that increased tax burden from the Inflation Reduction Act could exacerbate these challenges. The coalition calls for action and reflects a growing debate over the effectiveness and economic impact of government subsidies for green initiatives. You can read more, including that entire letter, over on our website this morning, carolinajournal.com. The headline, "Coalition Urges Congress to End Costly Green Subsidies, Citing Economic Harm." Turning our attention to some state news this morning, North Carolina Speaker of the House Destin Hall introduced a cryptocurrency piece of legislation in the General Assembly last week that would enable the state to invest in digital assets like Bitcoin, potentially making North Carolina a leader in aligning with the latest financial technology. The North Carolina Digital Assets Investment Act would diversify the state's investments by allowing the state treasurer to include digital assets into the state's investment portfolio. Representative Ross, Representative Brody, and Representative Scheitzer from Wake County signed on as sponsors of House Bill 92. The House Speaker in Destin Hall said about the legislation, quote, "We are seeing a rapid shift towards embracing blockchain technology and digital assets across the United States. Investing in digital assets like Bitcoin not only has the potential to generate positive yields for our state's investment fund, but also positions North Carolina as a leader in technological adoption and innovation. I am proud to sponsor this bill, and I thank my colleagues Republican Ross and Brody for their work in previous sessions to set the stage for this bill here in 2025. According to a press release, the key provisions of the bill include authorization for the state treasurer to invest in those assets. This provision allows the treasurer to include digital assets in the state's investment portfolio. Investment requirements. Digital assets must be exchange-traded products with a minimum average market capitalization of $750 billion over the past 12 months, as verified by commercially responsible methods determined by the state treasurer. The bill outlines strict guidelines for maximum investment allocation in digital assets and sets standards for their custody and investment management. And finally, it clearly defines and had standards that are provided to ensure that only qualified digital assets are included. So not any of these random coins that you see popping up on social media. Notably, at just under $2 trillion in total market capitalization, Bitcoin currently is the only cryptocurrency that would meet these requirements spelled out in the bill. The next largest cryptocurrency asset, which is known as Ethereum, clocks in at approximately $317 billion. So it is very much short there of these limits set in this bill. Legislators pointed to a variety of reasons to invest in digital assets, such as the U.S. dollar facing periods of inflation as well as devaluation, as well as enhancing the potential returns for the portfolio over time. According to representatives who signed this legislation, they said in a statement, quote, "Blockchain technology, decentralized finance, and other innovations in the crypto space will shape our future in many new ways, and North Carolina is poised to capitalize on these emerging opportunities." Dan Splur, who's the head of the Industry Affair Group at the Washington, D.C.-backed Blockchain Association, and who's also the co-chair of the North Carolina Blockchain Initiative Task Force, applauded Destin Hall for pushing the bill forward, noting previous legislation that aligned with this latest effort. He told Carolina Journal, "North Carolina has led on a digital asset policy. From the updated Money Transmission Act of 2016 to the Bipartisan Regulatory Sandbox Act of 2021, as well as last year's House Bill 690, which prohibited central bank digital currencies. Passing House Bill 92 will further cement the state's leadership in finance and in technological innovations." You can read more on House Bill 92 over on our website this morning. As it stands right now, the piece of legislation currently sits in the Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. If it is voted favorably out of that committee, it will make its way over to the very influential House Committee on Rules. From there, if it does also move past rules, it will make its way to the full House floor for a vote. Then it, of course, would go on to the Senate, and if it is to pass there, on to Democrat Governor Josh Stein's desk for him to decide whether to sign it into law or to allow the legislation just to sit and become law, or, of course, veto that legislation. We'll keep an eye on that and pass additional details along as soon as we get them. It's now 5:45 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We'll get another look at traffic on this President's Day Monday morning. An update with Boomer Von Cannon.
Yes, sir.
Hot. It's 5:52. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on a Monday edition, President's Day 2025. I thought we'd look at the history of President's Day this morning. Well, the story of President's Day begins in the year 1800, following the death of George Washington in 1799. His February the 22nd birthday became a day of remembrance across the country. At the time, Washington was seen as the most important figure in American history, and events like the 1832 centennial of his birth and the start of the construction of the Washington Monument in 1848 were cause for national celebration. While Washington's birthday was an unofficial holiday observed for most of the 1800s, it wasn't until about the late 1870s that it became a federal holiday. That's when Senator Stephen Wallace Dorsey of Arkansas proposed the measure, and in 1879, President Rutherford B. Hayes signed it into law. The holiday initially only applied to the District of Columbia, but in 1885, it was expanded to the whole country. And at that time, Washington's birthday joined just 4 other nationally recognized federal banking holidays. At the time, it was Christmas Day, New Year's Day, the 4th of July, and Thanksgiving. And it was the first to celebrate the life of an individual American. The second would, of course, be Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which was signed into law in the mid-1980s. The shift from Washington's birthday to President's Day began in the 1960s when Congress proposed a measure known as the Uniform Monday Holiday Act, which was championed by Senator McClory of Illinois. This law sought to shift the celebration of several federal holidays from specific dates to a series of predetermined Mondays. The proposed changes were seen by many as a novel way to create more 3-day weekends for the nation's workers, and it was believed that ensuring holidays always fell on the same weekday would reduce employers who did not want to use the holiday and not give it to their employees. While some argued that shifting the holidays from their original dates would cheapen their meaning, the bill also had widespread support from both the private sector and labor unions and was seen as a surefire way to bolster retail sales. The Uniform Monday Holiday Act also introduced a provision to combine the celebration of Washington's birthday with that of Abraham Lincoln, which was February the 12th. Lincoln's birthday had been a state holiday in places like Illinois, and many supported joining the 2 days as a way of giving equal recognition to 2 of America's most famous statesmen. Senator McCrory, who brought this forward, was among the measure's major proponents, and he even floated the idea of renaming the holiday President's Day. This proved to be a point of contention for lawmakers from George Washington's home state of Virginia, and that proposal was eventually dropped. Nevertheless, the main piece of the Uniform Monday Holiday Act was passed in 1968 and officially took effect in 1971 following an executive order from President Richard Nixon. Washington's birthday was then shifted from the fixed date of February the 22nd to the third Monday of February. Columbus Day, Memorial Day, and Veterans Day were also moved from their traditional designated dates. However, there was some later criticism that popped up with Veterans Day as we went through the 1970s, and Veterans Day was moved back to its original date, November the 11th. And while Nixon's order plainly called the newly placed holiday Washington's birthday, it was not long before the shift to President's Day began. The move away from February the 22nd led many to believe that the new date was intended to honor both Washington and Lincoln, as it now fell between their 2 birthdays, almost right in the middle. Marketers soon jumped on the opportunity to play up a 3-day weekend with a series of sales. Thus, President's Day bargains were advertised at stores around the country. By the mid-1980s, Washington's birthday was known to many Americans as President's Day. This shift had solidified in the early 2000s, by which time as more than half of the 50 states changed the holiday's name to President's Day on their state calendars. Some states have even chosen to customize the holiday by adding new figures to celebrate. Arkansas, for example, celebrates Washington as well as other individuals within the state. Alabama uses President's Day to commemorate Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who was born in Alabama in the month of April. Washington and Lincoln still remain the two most recognized leaders, but President's Day is now popularly seen as a day to recognize the lives and achievements of all America's chief executives. Some lawmakers have objected to this view, arguing that grouping Washington and Abraham Lincoln together with less successful presidents minimize their legacy. Congressional measures to restore Washington and Lincoln's individual birthdays were proposed in the early 2000s, but did not gain much attention. So there's a little history on your Monday morning on President's Day. That's going to do it for a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We are back with you tomorrow morning 5 to 6 right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.